of the few residents there. My son Luke was crocheting in the corner, so I heard Patrice and everybody talking about the property, and enjoyed going through that process and had public comment and was involved a bit in that. I was also on the Catamount Outdoor Family Center board, and I still am since April 2017. I served as the president right when Catamount transitioned to town-owned land, and then I worked to implement the lease agreement to make sure that we followed all of those. That was part of my role. I'm currently still on the board, and I've attended a number of the CCF meetings, but I attended the one before, and Jeff said, well, is there any conflict of interest if I'm on this board and that board? And I'm open to whatever you guys have to say about that. But my view afterwards, Jeff, I thought we have a shared goal that the town is enjoying the property and invited out to use the property that's well maintained, taken care of. I do a lot of volunteering, probably 40 to 80 hours at least at Catamount, pulling invasives. I joined Laura Meyer and Terry, and this was like 2-3 years ago. They had Boy Scouts. We pulled invasives all day long. In my trail work, I pull invasives a ton. So I really just enjoy the property. By work, I've worked at G Healthcare, which was IDX since 2002 with Tim Kenny for a bit. And I'm currently still with G Healthcare, working remote. The office is no longer open. I'm the Global Commercial Operations Director. I lead a team of 25 people responsible for our IT systems for all of our service and support organization. I was a mechanical engineer. I have a bunch of other volunteer experience. I was on the board for our homeowners association, and with GE we had some volunteer activities. Volunteered up at Camp Abenaki, the Boys and Girls Club as an annual activity, so a number of things there. So I just really, the last thing I'll say is, one of the main reasons I'm interested in the CCF is I really enjoy getting to know other people in the town and working together with them on that. I did the mobility committee to do the official town map, and I worked with Stuart Meyer, Dave Westman, some others, and I just really enjoyed getting to know them. And like Stuart was such a wonderful person, and then I met Laura, who was on the CCF. So I like these committees as a way to get involved. And I'm a doer, I'm a worker, so I would be very active and participating. So.
Good. Well, thank you so much. So thinking about the conflict of interest, and Jeff usually asks that question, but it rises to the level of, we probably should discuss that a little further. I can remember a number of years ago that we had a person who served on the Solid Waste District board as our appointee, and he also was on a board of an organization that was opposed to landfills, and raised the question with him at that time as to whether that would be a conflict of interest. He gave us some interesting tidbits on that he didn't think so, and as it turned out, he was a very good member of both organizations for quite a long time. And we currently have another person who's on the Solid Waste District board as our appointee, who works for Casella. And so we were looking at what conflicts might pertain to that, and I think they've worked that out at this point. So I guess the question that I would have for you is, since there are two boards that you would be involved with, what would you do if there was a disagreement between the two boards on an issue?
I think correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the select board ultimately has decision-making authority over recommendations the CCF makes.
We would take recommendations from the committee.
I think, it's all about disclosing like why you think something some way. So, I would just be transparent and say like, well, from the Catamount, vested interest, maybe they want this and CCF wants that. Like maybe, it becomes an asset that I can kind of see both perspectives and vocalize both perspectives. You know, if the renewal agreement is for $30,000 a year instead of $1, then I could say, well, then Catamount's going to go bankrupt because we don't make any money. We're a nonprofit. You know, so I think I could bring kind of multiple perspectives, just share my thoughts. I'm not sure what the nature of the disagreement, right? It's hard to conjecture on what I would do exactly. But I mean, I think the goals are aligned, I think, right? But if there's like, if it becomes clear that there's like conflicting goals or conflicting interests, then I kind of disclose whatever conflict I might have and say maybe I shouldn't vote, or, you know, whatever the case may be.
Good, thank you. So other questions from the board?
Just a question / recommendation. One thing that I've done as a select board member a couple of times where there's an issue that the town, that's before the select board, and it involves people that I, as a lawyer, either represented as clients or even worse, was against and had cross-examined them in court. And the thing that I've done in those circumstances is recuse myself and actually physically leave the board and just go sit in the audience. I guess what I'm saying is that there may be specific moments that are finite that would be, you know, well, where you wouldn't be comfortable, or maybe you shouldn't partake in a decision. And just throwing that out, and now it's supposed to be a question. So recusing yourself for a specific issue, that's be something you'd be able to do.
Oh yeah, sure, I'd be fine with that. Right, I mean, I can just, if they say, hey, we really don't like the board of directors at the Outdoor Family Center, I'd say, well, you know, maybe I shouldn't be here because I'm one of them. But yeah, I can see that.
Okay, thanks.
I'd be happy to step out.
And I think it's
Other questions?
a good point that the one I hadn't considered when you and I just happened to talk about this is the license agreement is something that would be, I assume, approved by the select board and not by the Catamount Community Forest Management Committee. So I still would urge being cautious with conflict of interest. Sometimes it's not whether there's a real conflict of interest or not, it's whether it's perceived.
Yeah.
And I also would recommend you seek guidance, you know, go to both boards and say, here's the situation, what do you think? Is it a conflict of interest or not? So if you don't mind, a couple questions. You've had the opportunity to see the Catamount Community Forest Management Committee in action. What do you think we're doing right, doing wrong?
I think the scope is fairly narrow of the CCF. I think the personalities maybe of the leaders and their own personal interest has kind of influenced what they've spent more time on. And it's hard to tell as whether it's in the capacity of an official CCF activity or just a personal interest. So, you know, there's a strong emphasis on birding, which is wonderful. Like, I'll go out in early Sunday mornings and see many people out there. The bluebird boxes are great. There's a lot of things around birding and the birding community, which is a whole new set of people that I don't think, that really didn't come out to Catamount before that. I don't think it was the CCF's decision on deer hunting, but I think, you know, listening to Ethan Tapper, I think there's more work to do there, and, like, you know, figuring out whether or not we need to consider deer hunting again. But I know that was not the CCF's doing currently, but I think that's something they should probably take up.
And that's because of the damage, the overpopulation
Exactly,
of deer is
and
doing.
Ethan's doing that study now, so I'll be curious to see what comes of that, whether, you know, he finds this controlled area, you know, has better growth of hardwoods or whatever he's looking for, right? You end up with just nothing but beech trees because the deer eat everything else. So for the diversity of the forest. I mean, I think they've done a decent job on trying to plan ahead for the logging that's going to occur in 2023 in the one section. You know, there's like $10,000, I think, set aside to try to repair the trails. There's just a lot of uncertainty there. That's where personally I'd like to be helpful and be involved. You know, like, what is the condition of the trails? What do we have to return it to? I think maybe they're doing a good job. I think their scope's fairly small. And I think maybe what they could do is carve out more of what they have as a mission. The things that they've done have seemed helpful and nice.
Okay.
Yeah.
One of the concerns I have, and everybody, I'm on this Catamount Community Forest Management Committee as the select board, whatever representative, is the barn. And
Yeah.
if you don't maintain the barn, at some point, it's no longer going to be usable. Your thoughts?
Well, Jim's finally getting his stuff out of the barn, so that's a good thing.
That's step one, I guess.
No, I mean, I guess it was pulled back together with the first thing that the architect recommended. I mean, it's tough. We've got that barn right there at the entrance of Brennan Woods, right? And,
Right.
you know, that one's disintegrating. I think the Boy Scouts or somebody cut away all of the sumac that were encroaching on it so it wouldn't rot quite as fast. You know, but I think these historic structures are expensive to maintain and preserve. I mean, it seems like the best that we're doing is trying to minimize the decay on them.
Okay.
Absent a big grant to repair it, I'm not sure what, I would have any magic answer for that.
And then, this will be my last question, is what are your thoughts on how well is the relationship working, or how well does it work that there's the town-owned community forest, but there is a nonprofit operating programs under a license agreement?
I think it works well. I think the CCF's concerned about the viability of the land and and working with Ethan on the forest management plan. Like that was like the first 6 months or so of the whole CCF. I attended a lot of those. I think like taking care of the forest as an asset with Ethan and, you know, to conserve it for the town to use, and then the programming gets taken care of by Catamount at the Outdoor Family Center, to maintain the trails specifically, and then to have the camps and the other things. I mean, at one point I talked to Todd from the rec department and said like, hey, should we collaborate on summer camps? You know, you've got a summer camp listing, Catamount has a summer camp listing. Like that's another possible synergy. But I think the way the CCF is defined, it's like they're ensuring this piece of land is well cared for and taken care of, and Catamount runs the activities there. If I had one complaint, it would be the new special events permit, which we have. I just went through our budget. We have a bunch of large special events and bike races that people saw the permit and said, oh, we're not going to do it. Forget it. So, you know, there's like a little bit of a gap there with not fulfilling the mission of bringing people to the forest to enjoy it and use it because of the special event permit scared them away.
Okay.
So that would be my only complaint.
Very good, thank you.
Other questions?
Just to comment, you know, it's really nice to hear how involved you are and how passionate you are about giving back. And today I spent most of my day building fence on our family farm with a friend of mine, and it's not about money, it's about maintaining the land, and I just think it's really neat how you're obviously have that much passion and enthusiasm, and how involved your family is. I can just not only read but hear in your voice how you know, appreciative and how dedicated you are to that. So just, yeah, I applaud that.
Thanks, I appreciate that. Yeah, I feel it's a privilege to be able to
Absolutely.
have the land and work on it.
Yep.
If there are no other further questions, there is a motion suggested.
I'll move to appoint Hans Bueller to the Catamount Community Forest Management Committee for an unexpired term through June 30th, 2024.
Is there a second?
Second.
Is there any discussion on the motion?
Well said, Gordon.
Hearing no discussion, all those in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? So congratulations, and look forward to having you
Thank you.
on the committee.
Yeah.
Thank you, Hans.
One Thursday night of your life is now gone.
Every Thursday night.
A month, yeah.
That's fine. I was going anyway.
Moving on to tax sale authorization. Eric, you're going to talk about this?
Yep. Can everybody hear me okay?
We can.
Yes.
Yep.
Good evening, everyone. So as of the writing of my manager's report last week, there were 17 outstanding delinquent tax accounts with balances over $1,000 that have not been in communication with the town after written correspondence was sent to each of these parcels at the beginning of the month, asking to contract the town finance director to discuss paying the balance in full or creating a payment plan. You have a memo from Finance Director Shirley Goodell-Lackey included in your board packet that outlines the current status and next steps to consider. Each of these accounts has been receiving monthly invoices with a delinquent amount plus interest added. And per the recently amended policy for the collection and payment of property taxes, the delinquent tax collector, myself, the town manager, would next like to initiate a tax sale process working with the town attorney. How this would work is first, the town attorney's office would send letters to the delinquent accounts to seek resolution through payment or creating a payment plan with a deadline to do so, to follow up on our staff correspondence from earlier this month. Staff anticipates this will clear up a number of accounts. For accounts that remain delinquent or without a plan in place to pay the outstanding balance by the deadline established, and those properties would likely then proceed to a tax sale. Before you this evening's a motion suggested by the town attorney to engage his office with the tax sale proceedings, should the board wish to consider that motion this evening.
Thank you, Eric. So any questions for Eric regarding the process?
One of the things we discussed was kind of getting a history of each of the properties. So this is just the initial stage, is my understanding, to send the letter from the attorney. So before it would actually go to a sale, would it come back before the select board?
Yep, that's correct, Greg. This would be the first next step in this process to engage the attorney to. Our ultimate goal here is to resolve all these accounts, working with the delinquent taxpayers and not go to a tax sale. If the select board would like, we can update the board as we go. We can certainly share a history with the board as we get this number down. If we are going to consider going to a tax sale, certainly staff can provide any additional information as we go along here.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions, Jeff?
The only question I had was a real technical one. This all sounds fine to me. Is when the town attorney is going to send these letter on his or hers firm's letterhead, how do they sign it? Do they sign it as the town attorney or just representing the town?
I anticipate that that's how they approach it, Jeff. I haven't had that conversation with the town attorney just yet, but so I can follow up with them this week and see.
When I was reading this and it said on the firm's letterhead, my first thought was shouldn't be on town letterhead, but probably maybe not.
First thing a letter like that's going to say is this office represents the town of Williston relative to a delinquent tax.
Okay, so it'll be very clear to, yeah. Okay, good, thank you.
Any other questions? There is a motion suggested for this as well.
I'll move to engage the town attorney to assist the collector of delinquent taxes for the tax sale process.
Is there a second?
A second.
Beat me to it.
Any discussion on the motion? Hearing none. All those in favor of the motion say aye.
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 Any opposed? All right, then we're moving on then to the Chittenden County Communications Union District, the CUD. And Eric, you're going to talk a little bit about this. We do have a letter from the town attorney as well.
Yep, and we've also got Regina Mahoney from the CCRPC and Rob Fish from the Vermont Community Broadband Board on the call as well, if there's any questions for either of them during this discussion. Maybe Aaron, if you wouldn't mind just connecting Regina and Rob to the webinar's panelists.
Sure.
I'll walk the board through here. So as a reminder, Communications Union District, or CUD, is a new government that enables multiple communities to work together to bring broadband internet to addresses currently not served. After analysis working with the CCRPC, it's been determined that forming a CUD is the current best approach to access federal funding through the Vermont Community Broadband Board to assist with this work. And as a reminder, Williston has 173 addresses as of last May that do not have access to a broadband level of internet, which is a download speed of 25 megabytes per second and an upload speed of 3. As Terry mentioned, the town attorney distributed a legal opinion for the board this past week, answer a few questions staff generated. And as a reminder, to create a CUD, voters in at least 2 communities must support its formation through a ballot item. But currently, the communities of Essex, Shelburne, South Burlington, and Jericho are discussing a CUD this month. As of the writing of this report, the Essex Select Board has indicated it plans to place the question to create a CUD on the November ballot. We'll be considering action the first week of August to do so. I know Regina attended that meeting, so certainly she could share any additional information she has on the Essex discussions there. This evening, staff is seeking direction from the Select Board whether we'd like to proceed with asking Williston voters to establish a CUD at a special town meeting to be held on Election Day on November 8th. Other options for the Select Board to consider are waiting to see if a CUD is formed by other communities, and then considering asking the voters to join or doing nothing and not participating in a CUD if formed. Process-wise, should the board wish to warn a special town meeting for Election Day in November, staff will create the warning and ballot language for the town attorney for consideration at an extra Select Board meeting the first week of August. The only scheduled Select Board meeting is August 23rd, and the deadline for inclusion for local ballot items on the general election ballot is August 9th. And certainly the board doesn't have to take any final consensus or action tonight. If there's additional questions, if the board wants to meet to have any additional items answered that first week of August as well, that's certainly another option.
Thank you, Eric. Is Regina on the Zoom? And perhaps she can, if she has any information about other towns and their what they're doing.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Great. Yes, so we have had conversations at Essex, Shelburne, and South Burlington just last night. Coming up on Thursday night is Jericho. And I was unfortunately not able to attend the Shelburne meeting, but I can say with confidence, both Essex and South Burlington seem very confident in moving forward and putting this question to the voters. Certainly they have the same questions about not wanting to be the only ones who do that. So we are doing our best to keep everybody informed as best as possible. I know both South Burlington and Essex will be meeting on August 1st to finalize the language that they'll put on the ballot.
And this is Rob. I was in attendance at the Shelburne meeting, and it was the response was very positive.
Thank you both. So are there any burning questions that people have at this point? So we've discussed this now a number of times, and if we have any further questions to resolve between now and the first week of August for a special meeting.
The only question I have is, is there a difference, or what, I don't know how to correctly ask it. Is there a difference, would there be a difference between being one of the communities that helps form the CUD versus being a community that joins an already formed CUD? Does that question make sense, first of all?
Anyone
Sure.
wish to answer that one?
Sure, I can take a stab on it if you would like. In the legal sense of it, no, it does not make any difference. In the sense of in terms of influence, the founding members always have a little bit more say because you're going to be part of the founding effort that's crafting the bylaws. That's part of the initial public push. That is making some of those initial decisions. We also do encourage more than just 2 towns to vote at the first town meeting things. It's a vote of confidence. This is your announcement to the world, both to your residents and providers, that you are on board and your residents need service. So I would encourage, and my recommendation would be to vote, but that's would be to vote now. But if you join later, you're certainly still going to be welcome.
Thank you. And then my question is somebody going to be able to help provide the wording that should be warned? And I ask because I don't know if it makes a difference, again, whether the wording says Williston is voting to create a CUD or to join a CUD. And so I'm guessing we'll need some advice on how to properly word that.
Yep.
Yeah, oh, sorry, Art, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, Jeff, if the board would like to place this on the November ballot, it would be part of the formation phase for the CUD. We have some language in statute for the form of the question, and should the board want to proceed, I'd work with the town attorney to review a special town meeting warning and the ballot item. The one real critical piece of synchronicity here, we had an email conversation last week, is what to name this new government, and to make sure everyone votes to establish the same named government. So we make sure we shore that up.
Okay, and then it's a question for you, Eric. There is going to be staff time involved in this. Is that okay?
Yep, if the board would like to proceed, I'm committed to make this happen administratively. Certainly to have a representative, if we have a community member who has real good background in broadband, that would be certainly welcome. But if we did not have someone, I would certainly make the time to be at least our initial delegate to see this effort through.
Okay.
Unless there are objections, it looks like we're ready to move forward with this and talk about the wording for the ballot at a special meeting, hopefully in the first week in August. August 2nd is the proposed date at this time, which is a Tuesday.
I agree.
I'll be in Cape Cod, but I can zoom in from Cape Cod.
Yes.
I would just be a little cautious, having a bad experience with that.
I'll have my beer in the fridge just in case.
In case, right, all right.
All right, then we will move forward with that, and we'll be in touch as far as the date and the time for everybody's access to the special meeting.
But right now, we're thinking it's going to be.
Looking for August 2nd. At this point, probably, if 6 o'clock would work, that would be nice, but if not, we can work on that.
Okay.
Moving on to the local articles on general election ballot and universal mailing. And Eric, we had some information that we received this week on that.
Yep, this is a little more procedural for the board to consider, but it comes from the Secretary of State's office. The Secretary of State's office will be mailing a ballot for the November general elections, all active, not challenged registered voters in Vermont communities. The Secretary of State's office has notified the town that for any local articles, including election of justices of the peace, that action is required by the local governing body to authorize these articles to be universally mailed on the general election ballot. Town Clerk Sarah Mason is planning to include the election of justices of the peace on the general election ballot. And as the board just discussed, adding the inclusion of a local article regarding the creation of Communications Union District on that general election ballot. To meet the requirements by the state, a motion is suggested for the board's consideration.
Mr. Eric, regarding the process? Then there is a motion suggested.
I'd move to approve mailing a ballot to all active, non-challenged Williston voters for any local elections and articles that are included on the general election ballot for November 2022.
Is there a second?
Second.
Is there discussion on the motion? Hearing none, all those in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? And no abstentions? So we're moving in quickly, right on time actually, to item number 8, and that's our development bylaw amendment work session. So tonight we'll be doing that, and Eric, want to lead off, then we'll start with Matt and the memo that he has prepared for us.
Sure. Is Matt over in the room yet?
He's there.
Yeah.
He's in the house.
Okay. I see him on Zoom too. So, well, I'll just kick this off quickly and toss it to Matt. So this agenda item this evening is a work session for the select board to discuss the transmitted development bylaw amendments for consideration that includes the establishment of a form-based code overlay district in Taft Corners and the creation of a town-wide official map. The select board can discuss the transmitted amendment proposal and whether we'd like to make any changes. To assist the board, it's discussing, you've received from planning staff materials with the agenda that outline major policy items that have been a topic for discussion over the past 2 months, with options to change each of them in the proposal and their effects. Should the board decide to make any substantial changes as a result to the proposal, scheduling a new public hearing would be required. Staff can take any feedback from the select board as a result of this work session to prepare for additional discussion on August 23rd. At that time, the board could decide to consider action to either warn a new public hearing with any changes made. If no changes have been made, could consider adopting the zoning changes as transmitted by the Planning Commission, or could also decide to continue this work session at the August 23rd meeting. Additional time is required or additional information is sought from staff to follow up. This evening, staff seeking direction on begin this conversation on any possible changes and on process for the board moving ahead in this review.
Good, thanks. So Matt, you've prepared a nice memo for us with options that we can take a look at on 6 different topics. So if you want to start, we can take them one by one and see what kind of discussion results from that from the board.
Sure. Let's dive right in. And Eric or Aaron, I'm on the Zoom meeting, so I can screen share if needed, or if somebody else wants to screen share elements of the memo, that's just fine. It's not totally necessary, but there may become a point where a visual is helpful on the screen for everybody. So thank you, Eric, for teeing up the where we are procedurally portion of this. And the memo the board has in front of them has 6 items that staff perceives and or board members requested as the ones to address for specific discussion for direction to staff on changes prior to the development of a follow-up hearing draft of the form-based code, bylaw amendments, and official map. So let's dive right in. The first item for discussion is the Essex Alliance Church property, with comment from Chris Snyder Group. And this is a relatively mechanically simple request from Snyder, which is to remove this property from the overlay district, which would remove it from the purview of this code. This property is entirely within the Taft Corners zoning district. If it were removed from the form-based code area, it would be subject to the development standards of the Taft Corners Taft Corners zoning district and Chapter 22 design review district, as well as other relevant chapters in the bylaw related to access signage, nuisance, et cetera, as we've been reviewing development in this district for the last many years. A little more background on this. We do have a proposal that was submitted prior to the warning of the first public hearing on the form-based code for this project. And that means that the applicant is vested in that proposal if they continue to pursue it, and more pointedly, vested in the version of the zoning that existed at the time they submitted it, which is our old or current bylaws. So we're in process with that review. Staff's working on a staff report for the first DRB meeting coming up next week to begin review of that project under those bylaws. And the proposal that's vested in the Taft Corners zoning district version of the bylaws is all of the infrastructure, the streets, sidewalks, bike paths, most of the park spaces, and I would just, as a very rough estimate, say about 75% of the buildings on the site. The graphics we prepared in the memo show that the street layout as proposed is somewhat different from the one that would be required under the regulating plan if that were to move forward. Again, the applicant is proposing to plat streets as it shows on their proposal, and if they were to continue to pursue this development, it would prevail over anything that was adopted later on, including the form-based code. So the request is very simple: remove the property from the overlay district. The implications of removing it from the overlay district would be that all development going forward here would continue to be reviewed under the Taft Corners zoning district. Chapter 22 design review guidelines would be the major controlling chapters. If the property were to be left in the form-based code district, there's a lot of the form-based code that would not be able to be applied to it if this approval was continued to be pursued. The street layout would be vested. We would not be able to say, no, now you have to follow the regulating plan, because the platting of the streets and their design would all be part of that first phase. The design of most of the buildings on site would not be up for discussion for compliance with the form-based code. What the form-based code might apply to would be the design or at least architectural treatment of buildings that are in future phases of the project. Because those buildings today are just expressed as a footprint. To the extent that the applicant has that footprint on the site plan, they might have a right to that footprint, but the building form would have to follow the architectural standards to the extent that they're not in conflict with that established footprint on the plan. So how many windows, how many doors, how tall, what kind of materials, what arrangement of materials, et cetera, would be applicable going forward. And there would be a large element of staff review of anything going forward would be to say, well, we're under a project that's vested in the old rules but has some elements subject to the new rules, and here's how we think they ought to be applied. And there might be reasonable minds that disagree about exactly how to do that, such as zoning. So with a very brief overview, and you've read the staff description of the question, staff just looks for direction in a future hearing draft. Would the select board want to see this property included or excluded from the form-based code overlay district, identified for new streets or not identified for new streets in the official map and regulating plan?
Questions?
Well, I assume it's the obvious question is I'm going to ask it in the dumb way, which is, what does that mean? And what I mean by that is, how compatible is the existing zoning requirements with the form-based code? Kind of asking the question of, so 75% falls under the current zoning on the property, 25% using, the way you divided it up, falls under the new form-based code. Are we going to have a 25% of the project that just can't move forward because they're so incompatible? Are we going to end up with, will the result be a project where when you look at it, you're kind of like, there's that piece of it and there's that piece of it, and boy, do they look different. I'm just trying to figure out, what does this mean, to the developer? And it doesn't matter who the developer is, it's just, when you, and I assume this is probably the only property this is going to happen to, potentially happen to, I hope.
Well, we do have some other examples.
Okay.
And they're a little more firm in what's going to happen, in that there are future buildings that will be constructed in both Finney Crossing and Cottonwood Crossing that are part, at least as a footprint, they're part of an approved final plan. But there will be some applicability of architectural standards when those buildings come in for review and permitting. And it kind of goes both ways. I would say, on the balance, the architectural standards in the new code call for a type of construction that's likely a little more expensive. They also allow for some building heights that allow that new expense to be spread across a larger building potentially. And that was some of the balance that we were trying to strike in the draft code, was upping some of the requirements the town was looking for while offering more units on the same parcel of land, a more rapid approval process, et cetera. And when you have a project where you're not designing the entire site, but maybe you're really stuck just fitting a building in, there are going to be some elements where you come to the administrator and say, I really can't meet this or that requirement of the form-based code. I'm down to this footprint that was approved that I have a right to, but here's what I can do, and then it'll be up to the administrator to determine how to apply those standards. So, will the buildings look fundamentally different? They would look different, I think. There's one very small detail that we've taken some stakeholder feedback on in this new form-based code. Requires windows to be inset 3 inches from the building facade. And we've heard that that's very expensive to do, unless you're doing a masonry facade. So somebody might be making that decision. You might have a neighborhood that's mostly other materials, but goes to masonry or goes to something that's responsive to having to meet that architectural requirement. So I'm not sure if I'm answering the what happens question, but I think that's a start.
Well, yes, and that's very helpful. And there is, I mean, it's kind of hard to bound what is the answer to that question. One aspect of it that you didn't address that maybe will help me is the form-based code is really around pedestrian friendly, and having the buildings look and feel in a way which encourages that pedestrian-friendly atmosphere, for lack of better words. Is that going to be difficult to do on in this case, because this is the example before us, on that 25% of the remaining property that will be subject to the form-based code? Or is it going to be just a really odd situation where, yeah, it's kind of pedestrian friendly, but because it's surrounded by 75% that was done under a different set of zoning, you really don't achieve that goal at all?
So luckily,
does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, luckily the Taft Corners zoning district standards as they are require things like pulling buildings up to the street, and they are a very good attempt at creating a pedestrian-friendly environment.
And I wasn't trying to be critical, I'm just trying to
so,
understand the difference.
You know, these new proposed standards represent a refinement of that, and you might see a little bit different placement related to the street under the new code, but again, the footprints are already in the vested plan here. And my opinion as zoning administrator is those are part of what has been vested. What lives on top of that footprint isn't, and if somebody wants to change it, they need to do so in the direction of compliance with whatever code is in place. But what you're likely to see at the building scale around pedestrian friendliness is saying, for example, a building needs to have a door on its street-facing facade every 70 feet. We don't have anything like that in today's code. So you can have, and we do have in Williston, some very large expanses of building that you can walk along that don't have a door. We have a percentage of street-facing facade that needs to be in windows. We don't do that today. We have some rules about window elevation and proportion that we don't do today. And those are all things that our expert help has counseled us really do help create true pedestrian friendliness, because now that street-facing facade of the building is an element of the outdoor room that's created by the public street space. So we're really getting into how does it feel to be a pedestrian there, whereas where we are today is, well, we know we want to get the building on the street. That's a basic element. We're refining it. I think old and new codes are actually quite compatible when you're just trying to build on top of a footprint for a building whose location was pre-planned. Okay. It gets harder if you're trying to change what a street is, halfway down the street. We're not doing that.
Okay.
Other questions? I think the intent tonight is to get as many questions answered as we can, and at a future meeting, we'll hopefully make some decisions on the entire code, including any of the options that we're considering tonight.
Does part of that getting our questions answered, is part of that hearing from, let's say, the affected landowner, what their opinion about that is?
Well, I think we did that, at least on this one, okay, that they want everything under the existing code, so.
That wasn't what I was going to, information I was trying to find. I was trying to find out how onerous they believe or not, they believe having 25% subject to one type of zoning versus 75% to the other. What would be the impact to them of that? Not.
I think we heard that, but we
okay,
can certainly, but we can certainly ask them to give us something in writing on that, okay, which I think would probably be helpful to all of us. We can move on then to item number 2.
Okay. And I'd just say, in working through these, I'd encourage individual members to look at the options at the end of each section and
Yeah.
think about internally where you are, and that what would really be helpful for staff is if there's majority or consensus on any of those, and we can winnow these issues down or prepare specific language for you to look at as you continue to workshop this. That'll be really helpful to us. So topic 2, we're crossing over to the Burr Oak Knoll and LaPierre lands. These are the lands that surround Cottonwood Crossing and the Burr Oak Knoll, where the water tower is behind Maple Tree Place. And we received comments from the stakeholders, both during the public hearing and in writing, about the regulating plan layout that was proposed for this area. And there was a desire to do a couple of things. One was to align the regulating plan street with an existing easement over into Maple Tree Place. Another was to provide for more developable area. And so in the 6-panel illustration that we've provided you, there's a panel in the lower left corner that was provided by the landowner, and a version of that drawn in regulating plan version in the lower right corner, showing what that would look like. The red areas are the expanded or newly reconfigured developable areas on the blocks. You see some developable blocks to the east of the outer ring road. Originally, our consultant had recommended leaving that outer ring road edge blank as a place that carries a bicycle pedestrian path and provides a view shed out into the more rural portions of Williston from Taft Corners. The other thing I didn't mention is, in words, the applicant asked for an area, and in pictures, the applicant owner asked for an area to be excluded from the form-based code overlay district. And that area is represented by the area in blue on those lower maps. It is lands on the other side of the Velco easement from the Maple Tree Place property and bounded to the south by Interstate 89. And so we've just drawn it in blue on the regulating plan. The request is to take that out of the form-based code overlay. Again, if that was done, the zoning underneath it would prevail. In this case, that's the mixed-use residential zoning district, and design review, et cetera, et cetera. And so consideration and options for the board to think about here are what version of the regulating plan would the select board like to see in a package considered for adoption? Generally one that is a little more contained, or one that extends out to the east and to the west and south, or west and north onto the Burr Oak Knoll. And then I think separately to consider whether that area of land, I don't know if you can visualize it, it's vaguely visible from the highway in the winter months, but right adjacent to Interstate 89 and behind the Velco easement. So those are the things to consider there. In this case, we don't have any vested or pending development proposals for this land. We do know the land has significant and undelineated constraints. The map we provided in the upper right corner of your graphic shows some very old wetland delineations that were done over 20 years ago and may or may not be accurate today. But there are wetlands at the periphery of this parcel. And I often refer to regulating plan map and street and green space layout as a wish list that's very likely to be refined as future examinations are made of constraints and desired development pattern, et cetera. So the question here is, what would you put on the wish list? Probably knowing that it's a starting point for a conversation in the future as these streets are laid out.
So the Burr Oak Knoll, right, under the current regulations is not developable.
That's correct. It's identified as a conservation area in Chapter 27 of the bylaw is required to be avoided. And it's not quite the entire green on these maps. It's a reddish circle that fits within the green that comes out of a town plan map from the former open space plan.
Now, it continue to be not developable under this plan, under anybody's plan.
So under this plan, you know, we map it as that green area. And I would say that if developable area would be mapped on here, it would be seen as a refinement of that current sort of red circle designation. I think this, if it, to the extent that this regulating plan allowed developable area up onto the Bur Oak Knoll, this would control.
Okay, thank you. Other questions?
I'm sorry, I didn't, when you said this would control, what would, I didn't understand that, I'm sorry.
So we have a restriction on developing portions of what's green on this map around the Bur Oak Knoll. We have a proposal that would add developable area to the Bur Oak Knoll. To make it crystal clear, if the select board said add the developable area to the Bur Oak Knoll, we would go into that other map and essentially reduce the Bur Oak Knoll restricted area so that the two were in accordance with one another.
Okay. Okay. The question I have here is the one about cost and needing to purchase green space. And how would that work? So, you know, the property owner comes in under the form-based code and says, here's my proposal. It actually makes it, you know, you look at it or the zoning administrator looks at it and, you know, it's workable. I mean, there may be some tweaks, but it's workable. How does the piece where they say, but I need compensation for the green space, how does that work?
Mm-hmm. So I'll think about it two ways.
Okay.
So I'd like to shape your example a little bit and imagine that we're looking at one of these designated green spaces on this regulating plan that has street frontage, but it's designated green, and there's a building and accompanying site that the applicant wants to build on that piece of green space. And it's workable, it's physically workable, you know, it's on the street frontage, it could be built. That triggers the 120-day process we've been talking about. So the zoning administrator's job is to say, that's great, I'm denying this application right now. Your step is to go to the select board and find out if they really want this green space on the official map or not. The applicant goes to the select board and says, I've got a plan to develop here. You've got it as green space on the official map. Do you want to pursue acquiring this from me? And the select board has 120 days to enter a good faith effort to do so. So we need to, you know, have an appraisal done. We need to determine what the compensation would be. We need to negotiate that, et cetera, et cetera. So the first thing is compensation in that scenario is determined on a case-by-case basis. It's based on a real appraisal that everybody can agree on. And that's if the select board decides it wants to enter into proceedings. Select board also might say, well, let's get a rough idea of what this would cost us. Because maybe once we have a rough idea, we just know we're in no position to try to acquire this land. And so you could have that meeting, or you could say, come to think of it, this isn't our highest priority right now. It's on the wish list, but it's not really where we're looking to go, or we really like the idea of it being developed. We're gonna waive our right to make that decision. And at that point, the application can be taken back up by the zoning administrator and reviewed as if that green space was not there. So the reason I describe that as a sort of a single site is because I think that works better when you're imagining somebody building one building on one site. The other way to look at a property like this one, oftentimes in Williston, properties like this are master planned by an applicant, developer, or landowner. And there might be a bunch of things on the official map and regulating plan that don't align with constraints or just desired development pattern, et cetera, for the landowner. If they were looking at the whole property and trying to master plan it, I would probably say, well, let's not do the permit and denial thing. Let's get you in front of the Planning Commission and Select Board to ask to amend those two documents. So this is the, you know, I want to build in a different pattern option. And you know, the applicant could come in and say, well, I have a plan for development. I can show you what it is. I can tell you I'm going to meet everything else in the form-based code, but I need to rework the baseline regulating plan, including where the streets and green spaces are, in order to make it work. And you could do that, and now what the applicant wants to do in terms of street and green space placement and what the map says are one and the same. And you're not entering into that sort of negotiation or decision point, because if you're master planning the whole thing, let's just all agree on the map up front. Okay. And then development can proceed on a per site basis.
And would that be what's described as the bonus option?
So I'll have to, let me scroll down to my bonus option. So yeah, and really, I think what we're hearing from our stakeholder community is, yeah, that sounds great, but bylaw amendments can take 2 years. Yep. They can sort of languish, and if these things are bylaw amendments, we're concerned that we'll just sort of die by 1,000 cuts or by 1,000 days of process. So the bonus option says, and this might be one to think about regardless of any particular project, is right, to develop a select board policy that the board members can agree on that says, we will handle these requests efficiently. We will give folks who want to change the official map and regulating plan a timely answer to their questions. We won't take 2 years to do it. You're not committing that the answer is yes, right, or yes, exactly what you're asking, but you're saying we won't use procedure as a tool or time as a tool to say no. We'll just review it and we'll say yes or no, and we'll say why. Okay. And there are some boundaries expressed within the draft form-based code mostly about street layout and walkability that say, you know, what's a good walkable pattern and what isn't, and what are the boundaries under which those changes should be reviewed. There's also a map in the regulating, or in the code, an illustrative map that talks about, for example, having green spaces showing the 2.5-minute walk shed around them and the coverage of the Taft Corners area by that. That might be a boundary. You say, well, we don't want to lose a green space or move a green space so far that we're creating a bunch of Taft Corners that's not quickly walkable to a green space. So again, it all happens at the select board. The bonus option would be to come up with a policy that might offer a little more of an olive branch to the development community, saying, we take this seriously, we take our need to be involved in this seriously, and we will commit the time to considering those requests in a timely manner.
All right, good, thank you.
Haven't we done that before? Didn't we change zoning?
Don't recall.
Well, we have the specific plan process also.
Well, yes.
Which is along those lines.
Yeah.
I mean, it's to change zoning for a particular piece of property when there is a public benefit.
Right.
And this, to me, feels somewhat similar to that, if not very similar.
It is, and you know, our experience with specific plans has been, well, it's been a long time. Some of them took a very long time, including some that didn't come to fruition. Our most recent one was about an 8-month process that ultimately did not get to the select board because the planning commission voted no. The other thing we've talked about is writing in a policy that says we always want the planning commission to transmit requests to make these amendments to the select board with a yes or no recommendation, but always transmit. Again, don't make the procedure the barrier. Right. But just put the decision to the select board as efficiently as possible.
Okay.
And just a nuts and bolts thing, that process that you've just described, where the planning commission would always forward a recommendation one way or the other to the select board, that wouldn't be part of the bylaws. That would be part of a separate
That would be policy, I think.
Policy that we would have.
Yeah. And it's really everybody sitting down and saying, we're committed to operating this thing in a way that works for everybody, and you're kind of self-governing to say that.
Okay.
Other questions on topic number 2? Moving on to topic number 3.
Okay, so this is our third of the stakeholder requests, and this has to do with the Taft Corners Associates property. So we're west of Route 2A and south of Route 2, generally speaking. And a couple things we're talking about here. And the board received a late, so it wasn't in your packet, but emailed later, letter from Jeffrey Davis, I think expressing most of what we've summarized here, but I'll try to make sure we cover it all. So the first issue is another boundary question. Where should the southern boundary of the form-based code overlay be in this part of town? And so the upper left map you see on the graphic shows the boundary generally following the outer curve of Harvest Lane around by the Home Depot and Walmart parking lots, and then coming up behind REI, and then doglegging out over to cross Route 2A, just north of the soon-to-be former police barracks. So this is the boundary we went with. I think when we had our preliminary presentation to the select board, we discussed how it's growth center all the way to the interstate, but our consultant's initial recommendation was not to include everything all the way to the interstate in the form-based code overlay. The underlying district here is mixed-use commercial. It's essentially the big box district, but it actually has some standards in it since about 2004 that make it awfully hard to build a conventional single-tenant big box store. Requires buildings to be brought to the street, includes a smaller wrap of stores. It's been pretty difficult for folks to develop under anyway. So there's that boundary, and that was based on an idea of, well, you know, what might be a logical boundary that still leaves some of that more conventional large box development out and, you know, nearby to the highway and close to a trucking route on Marshall Ave, et cetera. So the request we've had from Jeff Davis and Jeff Nick is to move that boundary to the north to Marshall Avenue. In other words, everything south of Marshall Avenue would continue to live in that mixed-use commercial district. And their reasons, as expressed in their letters, are that they don't necessarily see multi-story residential as being especially viable here. They see a multi-story requirement, which is in the draft code, as being incompatible with some of these larger retailers who want access to their roof, either for skylights or mechanical, et cetera, or they just don't want people or even another use upstairs from their use. And so it's a question for the select board. Does the select board want to move forward with a regulating plan that takes more of those lands and leaves them in the mixed-use commercial district? Does it want to leave the boundary where it is? The compromise position that the Planning Commission discussed is the version in the lower left corner of the graphic. That black line, it could be a different southern boundary. It's about 150 feet south of Marshall Avenue. And the rationale behind that is to have like kinds of development on both sides of Marshall Avenue, which, you know, will continue to be a really major corridor in the area. So you wouldn't have multi-story residential across the street from single-story retail. You might have multi-story mixed use on both sides. So that's the boundary issue. And, the other things that we saw in the Davis letter, one we'll get to, which is the question about green space and the designation on the regulating plan and official map of the large area of green space in about half of the Harvest Lane Island. This was something we had some Planning Commission members felt very strongly that there was potential to create a large outdoor civic space within that part of town, and not a lot of other places in this district where that could happen. thought that it ought to be on the town's wish list, as I've been referring to it. And in Mr. Davis's testimony and letters, he sort of talks about, does that really make sense? Is that something that would work in Williston? And we'd like it, in his words, to remain developable under the base zoning. So that's something else for the board to think about. And the last comment we received from Mr. Davis, I also have a separate point on, which is the discussion of procedure and what's administrative, what goes to the DRB, and what happens in front of the Planning Commission and Select Board. So I think I might save that one as a component of that. But the biggest concern is there's not a lot of room in this code as drafted for the DRB to hear something and make adjustments to the requirements of the regulating plan. So the regulating plan says you build a street here and you build a green space here, and especially you build a street here. And then it allows the zoning administrator to let that street be built anywhere within 75 feet of where it's shown on the map. So it essentially can be moved, the size of its own footprint one way or the other, but it cannot be eliminated under any kind of administrative approval, and it cannot be shifted any farther than that with an administrative approval. And as drafted, there's no route to go to the DRB and ask for that change. The route is via the Planning Commission and Select Board under a regulating plan amendment. So I'll maybe touch on that when we get to the procedures conversation.
Okay.
Further questions regarding this, number 3?
So image 3C with that demarcation on it is an attempt to, I don't know what the right words are, so if I choose the wrong words, sorry, to hide the big box retail by putting form-based code-like buildings in front of them, so that the form-based code area on the other side of the street, I guess that would be the north side of Marshall Avenue, aren't necessarily looking at big box, single-story retail stores. Instead, they're looking at structures that conform to the form-based code primarily. They'll know they're behind them, the retail. Viable option?
Is that a viable option?
Yes.
Yes. I mean,
Okay.
so what it does, to expand on the way you described it, is it makes Marshall Avenue a cohesive public street. That,
Yeah.
if you walk down it, drive down it, bike down it, it's going to feel like something. And, in the street specifications that come with this, we do imagine a different sort of Marshall Avenue with, not fundamentally different, but with a cycle track and a little different bit of a layout. But even if you imagine what Marshall Avenue is like now, that you would be walking or biking up through that street, and you would have this sense of enclosure with buildings around you. You ultimately would not be seeing Interstate 89 or, the Walmart Home Depot buildings back there. You'd be traveling along something that had a frontage with, again, doors and windows on the street and life and activity, et cetera.
Yeah. And how would parking work?
So how would parking work? The boundary here is about 150 feet south of the edge of Marshall Avenue. And we're talking about a maximum building depth in the building form standard of 80 feet. So most likely, similar to the way the code envisions access happening with alleys and other places, you would come in through a limited number of either curb cuts or new streets that stub into this, and then get in behind the building. So, with multi-story residential, if you're truly maximizing the potential, you are definitely talking about parking underneath the building to some extent. But there is also room in that depth for utilities and surface parking. So, at 150 feet, you've got 80 feet of building, but you've got another 70 feet to work with for parking, utilities, ramps, whatever else needs to happen back there.
Okay. And would there be a traffic impact so that the Marshall Avenue as envisioned can't happen because of the amount of traffic it needs to support because of the retail draw? Does that make sense, that question?
So Marshall Avenue, as envisioned in the street specifications, would still be capable of carrying the traffic that it carries today, plus planned expansion. In other words, we're not taking away turn lanes at intersections or anything like that, which is none of Marshall Ave is really multi-lane. It breaks to multi-lanes at the intersections. There's no proposal here to take any of that away. Does that answer the question?
It does, but it equally raises a concern of, to me, the concept of pedestrian friendly and encouraging, folks to park, get out of their car and walk around if they're driving there or taking transit there, is somewhat thwarted when you have heavy traffic on the streets that are part of this. So I have the same concern about Route 2 and Route 2A. How are we going to integrate those into this? How are we going to make it so that the volume of traffic they need to carry doesn't thwart the goals that we have for this overlay district, which is the truly pedestrian friendly, a place people want to go and get out and do that shopping kind of like you do a little bit on Church Street. You browse.
So we do have in those new street sections, thinking really far into the distant future, configurations of that right-of-way that provide some separation between pedestrians and those busier streets. So whether it's the space that the street trees go into, the fact that you're dealing with like a curbed or a separated bike lane as opposed to an on-pavement bike lane, the integration of street parking in some places where the parked cars now begin to serve as a barrier. It's not going to be a quiet side city street. And, I think the other end of the spectrum you're describing is some things have really adequate pedestrian facilities but can't really be called walkable because they're just not very pleasant to be on. So, a separated bike path along a 50-mile-an-hour state highway, it's totally safe to be on, but it probably won't be the first place you choose to go if you don't have to. Over time, you can maintain the flow in terms of vehicles per hour while also calming the traffic. So you add the granularity to the side streets because now you have trees, now you have parked cars. Stuff is moving, but it's not, I don't know if I've bike commuted through Marshall Avenue many times, and there's a lot of jackrabbit starting that goes on because when the light turns green, the lane width and the road width says floor it. You can design a street that moves the same number of cars per hour that does not communicate that kind of behavior to the driver. And that's really what those street specifications are about. They need to work in concert with one another.
Okay.
The Planning Commission did consider image 3C,
They did.
and why did they not do that?
I brought a Planning Commission member with me. I don't know, Megan, how you feel about taking a stab at that. I'll need to have you come on.
Forgive the tone of the question if that sounded bad. I don't, it's a sincere question. I'm not judging anything.
Okay. I don't have the color vision, so I have to get up to speed on what 3C is.
Adjust the overlay district boundary.
Right, so this was one of the compromise scenarios. So Ted, can you repeat the question?
What the Planning Commission considered but did not adopt that. What was the rationale? You can get back. Okay, I don't mean to put you on the spot.
So
So this is the boundary.
that was
as
the
transmitted.
original, that was the transmitted one? Okay, 3A.
And this was, the compromise was to move it all up, so it was just.
Right, okay, so the one we transmitted, I think the really big difference is maintaining the, is that correct? Am I reading this correctly? So one of the big differences is maintaining the large green space on Harvest, no.
Well, there's a question for everybody about whether you're going to designate green spaces outside of what is ultimately the form-based code boundary. I think the other thing is the transmitted version includes this added grid that these are the light orange streets that would be south of the heavy black line in 3C. So there's more potential for this sort of granular residential development to take place if it's kept in.
Right.
Anything further, Ted?
No.
Anything further from,
Megan, before you go, sorry. Could you, I know this has been asked before and it's been answered, but I think it might be useful to hear again because we're talking about, the single-story retail. The area that's now occupied by Home Depot, Walmart, and I forget the name of the third building. Those were removed from the overlay district. What was the rationale for that?
I don't think they were ever in the overlay district.
Well, I believe at some point at least they were considered, because I remember having a discussion, and to be honest with you, I was a little bit excited by the concept that, these uses that are there now may not always be the uses that are there, and so they should be in form-based code because that provided a lot of options for change, if that made sense. But now they're out, and I never quite understood that. Sorry. And maybe you're not the right person to ask, and if that's the case, I apologize.
Yeah, no, I mean, Matt may be able to give you more history there. My recollection, which is not perfect, is that we never really considered. It was sort of delivered to us already
That way.
excluding
Yeah.
those
Okay.
properties. So I don't think that ever really came up as an active discussion for us.
Yeah.
And I believe it was the consultant and Matt who
Yeah.
would probably know more about that.
And I doubt I'm hiding anything. I'm trying to figure out what's the difference between what's already been excluded or is not in the overlay district versus what is being proposed also to not be in the overlay district, or not proposed, but is on the table for consideration. Okay. All right, thank you.
I can give you just a little bit more on that. So part of it is, remembering that the code comes out of the vision plan process. And the vision plan process involved a lot of public input. It also involved a team of designers looking at this area and giving a first draft vision back to the Planning Commission, which included this boundary that was not the same as the boundary of the growth center. So we started our process with our request for proposals and our consultant saying, what's on the table is zoning in the growth center.
Okay.
Tell us what to do. And when we asked our consultant, well, why did your team choose to leave these properties out? So the first thing is, each of them is already developed with something. There's proximity to the interstate and just starting to get into some noise impact issues for residential. There's some topography at work here that starts to separate these from the rest of the growth center. And then the last part that I don't know if it was ever discussed at the Planning Commission level directly in relation to these properties, but one of the outstanding issues that is in the vision plan and discussed by the Planning Commission is how to bring focus to this relatively large area. There was quite a bit of concern at the Planning Commission level in the visioning process that Taft Corners Growth Center is about 987 acres. It is sort of developed in this kind of spotty pattern where there's opportunities for infill or redevelopment scattered throughout. And what do you do so that the phase one of redevelopment of Taft Corners under this code is at all cohesive? And so I don't think we ever necessarily said, well, one way to do it is to shrink the boundary down here by Walmart, but it does sort of have that effect. And, you know, I view the code in its draft form as a framework where if in a number of years it did make sense to expand to provide those additional opportunities for other types of development or redevelopment on those sites, it's certainly something the Planning Commission Select Board could consider.
So it's kind of that concept of the overlay district can be too big, and because you lose that focus.
Right, and we're dealing with an area that's just naturally got a boundary, and it's going to be so big no matter what we do. What the town can do beyond boundaries is think about where it might focus investments in infrastructure or, you know, other incentives, things like that. And so that may be some follow-up work to actually adopting the code.
Okay.
Any further questions, comments regarding topic 3? We'll move on to topic 4, building height.
All right. So I think it's safe to say that the predominance of negative public comment about the code that the select board heard was about building height. And we've provided in the graphics a couple of illustrations that I'd like to go over in providing some context around building height, and also a little bit about the draft code. And I think the bulk of negative public comment was about maximum allowed building heights, but it is worth understanding that there are also some minimum required building heights in this code, varying between 2 and 3 stories minimum. And this is again about, you know, creating a cohesive pattern along the street, to some degree having the town make efficient use of this land that is really hoped within this district to contain the vast majority of new development in Williston for the next generation. You know, that was sort of the numbers that we were seeing when we projected this. So, and of course, building height, as the Planning Commission wrestled with it, was always talked about in relationship to what it might or might not achieve as it relates to affordability. And at a very basic level, allowing additional building height allows somebody to put more dwelling units on the same size piece of land, and therefore allows the cost of that land to be shared across more dwelling units, reduces the land cost per dwelling unit in a project. So there's some other nuances to building height. I've talked about them a little bit before. The way building height is measured in the draft code is different. The first thing is the building form standards all limit height by stories, but they all talk about a maximum height to the top plate of the top allowed story. The tallest districts allow 5 stories with that top plate at 64 feet. So the top of the top floor is at 64 feet. The illustration provided, the photograph provided at the bottom of this page shows some buildings across the street from one another in Finney Crossing. And the reason we chose to show this illustration is because in the draft code, building height is measured from the average elevation of the sidewalk along the street facade. And that's different from the way we do it today, where we use the average finished grade at the foundation. And you can see in the photograph that the 3-story building on the left is elevated quite a bit above the sidewalk. And soil is mounded up over there.
You have sharing rights too, by the way.
I'll see if I can do it. I just need to be enabled and I can.
Yeah, you are a presenter, so you should be able to.
I'm getting host disabled participant screen.
Okay, let's look at that.
Happy to do it if we can. While we're
I'll
trying
give you
to.
the thumbs up when we figure that out.
All right. So while we're trying to do that, I'll just keep going. But the point is you can't mound dirt up around a building to shorten its measured height in the new code. But the new code allows taller buildings. It simply does. The current code allows 3- and 4-story buildings, maximum height of 52 feet. Mechanical equipment in the current code can extend above that 52-foot height. I don't have an example where that's happened. It has happened in other places where we limit height to 36 feet. So in the new code, the tallest buildings are allowed at 5 stories and 64 feet. And there's a desire in this code, coming out of the vision and the idea of doing something unique, to encourage a pitched roof configuration. And one of the ways that's encouraged is that you can have occupied space within that pitched roof in the form of an attic story. There's quite a bit in the building form and architectural standards about what an attic story is. It's not just another story, you know, on top of the 5th story with a wall that's pretending to be a roof. The roof has a required maximum or minimum pitch. Dormer design has some limitations around it so that dormers are used and they're real. Again, not just pretend window projections from an extra floor. And with the steepness of roof pitches allowed, it is possible to build, you know, the tallest building with the steepest roof pitch and end up somewhere at the maximum depth of 80 feet with the gable on the short side of the building, like most buildings are built, 111 feet. So functionally, that's where the draft is today. There are a number of ways in response to that larger maximum building height, the select board could ask for revisions to this draft that would reduce it. One is there could be an absolute number of feet above clear sidewalk above which nothing is allowed to extend. In other words, you can have that pitched roof, but if you've got 5 stories, maybe you can't always use the very steepest, pointiest pitched roof. So there could be an upper limit. There could be a simple across-the-board reduction in the number of allowed stories in some of the building form areas, and a commensurate reduction in the number of maximum feet to that top plate. So there's a lot of ways to deal with building height. It's just a question of the board, having heard all the testimony of the commission and the public, giving the staff some direction about where it would like to go.
Could you take a second to explain where the various building heights came from for the different districts?
So,
for instance, why in the town center and storefront, it's described as storefront, subset of town center, which both have the 64 as the maximum. Just what was the thinking why that was the appropriate elevation or height to use?
sure. So in a very general sense, and each of the quadrants of Taft Corners is a little unique, the idea is to start with the maximum heights in the more central areas and transition out to the lower heights at the edges.
Okay.
And especially at the edges that butt up against the existing residential districts. So the strollable neighborhood with the 3-story, 42-foot height limit, that's the yellow on the top of the page. That actually represents a reduction in potential maximum height from what the zoning allows today. And then we go taller as we move toward the middle, and Shopfront, which has the same height limits as Town Center, is just Town Center with a required retail-capable first floor. So it's the same buildings, but it's the one place where we say we really want to see retail on the ground floor. Everywhere else, we say you may have retail or residential. It's the choice of whoever's building the building.
Okay. As part of the zoning administrator's discretionary permit review and, I don't know, approval or issuing process, if a landowner came in and said, I want to build a 5-story building with X roof on top of it, pitch roof on top of it, and further therein, let's say the town center part of this, could you say no to, could the zoning administrator say no to that because it just doesn't fit for one reason or another? Or are they allowed to do that no matter what because that's the way the code is written?
The zoning administrator could not say no based merely on height. There are a whole lot of other things that come into play once you're doing that, though. number one, the taller the building is, the bigger it is, the more parking you've got to come up with. We have relatively low parking minimums here, but you're going to have to come up with the parking, and at some point, you're either not going to want to go any further underground with it, or you're not going to want to consume any more surface space with it, or will simply run out of lot area. Keep in mind, you know, we have a 30-foot parking setback throughout all of these districts, so there's parts of somebody's site that are simply not accessible for parking. You're going to have to come up with your 15% minimum open area, some of which is going to happen on the parcel somewhere. 15% has to do with the footprint of the building. So it's really difficult to max out a building in every single dimension within this code. And when we've modeled this on a couple of sites, we run into that, you know, pretty quickly. We go, well, yeah, we could do 5 stories if the first 2 floors were a parking deck, but then there's no reason to build 5 stories. Yeah. So there's some interplay there. But whatever these maximums are, and however they're expressed, if somebody stays within them, then that's not a reason to say no to the project.
Okay.
So, you know, you want to set them at a level that is acceptable to the select board.
Would reducing those stories or heights be detrimental, in your opinion, to the goals of the form-based code?
Yes. Everything we've heard in the vision about affordability, and honestly, also just some of what we've talked about in terms of flexibility. Sometimes it might make sense for a building to go up like that. Or as one developer told me about the shop frontage, if you're gonna make me carry empty retail space for 1.5 years on the ground floor of this building because you really want the retail space, you gotta give me 4 rentable residential stories up above it.
Okay.
And that's, you know, that's one person who develops properties like this expressing their experience. You know, but there is a balance there, and sometimes extra height might make it pencil. And at our most great heights, what you're doing is you're getting that pitched roof. And remember, there are ways to build flat roof buildings in this code. The easiest one is to represent that roof is solar ready. Planning Commission really landed on a point of saying, we don't want to require pitched roofs to the point that we're precluding somebody's ability to develop solar. Solar ready means the roof can structurally support the solar panels and the conduit is there for the wiring if they need it. And that's, we're not saying you must install the panels. We were advised that we couldn't say that. We're saying you need to be solar ready. So there's very little in here stopping somebody from building that flat roof. If they want the pitched roof, they do get the added benefit of being able to occupy some of that space.
I realize this is a difficult question to ask, so in your opinion, is the concern about building heights and its impact on views, you know, and just the look of buildings at what is proposed to be permitted, is that being somewhat overblown, i.e., when I actually see a buildings or set of buildings that are at these heights and number of stories, my concern, I'm not going to have the same concern as I feel I have right now because they sound high to me.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think number one, the concerns you're hearing about height are real and heartfelt and not made up. Change is hard. Growth and change is hard, and especially when it feels like it's fast. And we certainly entered into this process having heard an awful lot of criticism about the pattern and design of growth and change that has occurred in Williston, especially in the last 10 years, and really set out to try to address a lot of that in the architectural standards and in the idea of adding the organizing element of a regulating plan to the town's toolbox. From my personal experience, buildings look the worst when they're under construction, and then you kind of get used to It's hard when they take longer to build. We've all heard an awful lot about the 4-story Blair Park Hotel. And I certainly wish there was a better example architecturally and process-wise of a 4-story building in Williston. There's any number of things I could tell you that building does not meet in terms of the architectural standards and site layout standards that it would have to meet under the new code. It's 4 stories slammed up under a relatively flat roof for one, in order to make our 52-foot height limit. And, you know, somebody might say, well, why don't you just only let them build 3 and then the roof can be a better pitch? That's true. But the other thing, I think, is that because of the openness of the development pattern in Taft Corners, we do hear a lot about views of the mountains, whether it's the Adirondacks or Mount Mansfield. I would say at least 80% of the time when someone says something to me about the view, they say, when I drive through Taft Corners, I really like being able to see. Well, when I drive through Route 2A, I see, and we refer to that as the windshield perspective. And when you put buildings on the street, they're going to block the views of the mountains from the windshield. They will. And they do. You know, we've had that already in some of our development pattern, and it's different. We talked about traffic flow today and the reality that people are still going to drive cars for a very long time and we need to move them. But I would not say that this code or plan is focused on creating the most visually exciting atmosphere for someone who's behind the wheel of a car. It's people-centered. And, you know, when you're walking down the street on the sidewalk and the building is 10 feet to your left or right, it doesn't really matter how tall it is anymore.
Right.
Because it's just a wall that's next to you. And what's more important is, am I walking by a big blank cinder block wall, or am I walking by some windows? Are there other people around because there's people living in the buildings, or is it the side of a warehouse or a loading dock? Other qualitative things come into play, and you know, it's a question of being a rural community that's turning into something other than a rural community, and has been for a really long time.
Yeah.
There are places in Williston where there will continue to be views of the mountains and nice Sunday drives to take. This might not be one of them under this or the current zoning, frankly.
Okay.
Could you touch on the bonus option that is listed here? Add a metric to limit the maximum height of a pitched roof above an attic story?
Yeah, so I sort of alluded to this earlier. This is the idea of saying you can have so many stories, you can have a pitched roof with an attic story, but in no event can you go above some number. And so the numbers here are a little funny. I gave the example of limiting total building height to 81 feet. And the reason I picked 81 feet is because with a building at the maximum depth of 80 feet, with a gable going on the short side of the building, because we're not going to build a gigantic gable facing the street, at a 512 pitch, our minimum allowed roof pitch, you're at about 81 feet. So in other words, that's the shortest 5 stories plus an attic story building you can build under the flattest pitched roof that the town would allow. If you start thinking that you want an absolute height lower than 81 feet, it's probably time to think about dropping a story from the maximums. So, you know, going around kind of thinking about what you're looking at. I mean, I've been doing this for a couple of years now in Williston, and it means every single place I go with tall buildings, I'm counting stories. I just walked by a 6-story building. I just walked by a 7. Oh, that's a 3. Okay. What does it feel like to me? And I'd encourage you to think of places you've been the same way, and then imagine that applied to Williston. And, you know, again, changing the numbers is mechanically very easy. It's thinking about what it means when you do that, as you were exploring about viewshed, or as we talked about affordability, viability, economic resilience, et cetera.
If I'm standing on the porch of, is it Big Sky? Did I get the name of the restaurant correct, in Richmond? And I'm looking across Bridge Street. Do you know how many stories those buildings are?
3 or 4.
Okay.
Probably just 3.
Yeah, just curious. It's a wall of buildings, but there's something about it that doesn't feel bad.
I was in Bristol over the weekend. A lot of Bristol is 3 and 4.
Okay.
A little bit of it is 2. You could take all of Main Street Bristol and build it like in the Maple Tree Place Green. It's tiny. But the buildings that front the street are generally mostly 3 and 4, with a few 2s and the very occasional 1 mixed in.
Yeah. It's big spruce, that's what I meant to say.
Yeah, big spruce.
Sorry.
Came to me just.
Sorry, restaurant.
Approximately how much of the overlay district, and percentage-wise, I mean, and you may not have this off the top of your head, but would the maximum height of the 5-story apply to?
Probably about 65%, and it is very ballpark, but if you think of your regulating plan map, anywhere you see red, orange, or light orange, we're talking about the 5-story maximum right now. Or sorry, red or dark orange, I gotta go back to my graphic. Light orange, we go to 4 and 53 instead of, so red and orange
Okay.
on that map.
So but you said like approximately 65?
Yeah.
Okay.
But it's quite a lot of it. It's not a small portion of the district, for sure.
Not to go backwards, Matt, but the attic story, if I'm understanding, that's an option. It's not like, has to be done. Is that
That's correct.
So I just had a bunch of emails. This is like the hot topic that I've gotten through email for building height. And I get the viability of sharing the cost as multiple stories are built. Has it been considered aesthetically and for housing, like doing 3 stories with an attic? So that we're not reaching that maximum height or that obtrusiveness that I think a lot of townspeople are worried about?
We certainly thought about different numbers. One of the ideas was we allow 4 right now.
Right.
4 with if there's an attic above it, nothing in the attic, essentially. So one of the thoughts was, well, what's the right, we want to take a step up from that at some level, because we know what we have isn't quite getting us where we want to go. Just what we're seeing in the field is not a lot of affordability. And we know we want to follow up all of this code work with some discussion about requiring some affordability. So what's the right context in which to do that? So in the planning commission's sort of wrestling with this, the most they ever considered is what they transmitted to you. I don't think we ever talked about 6+1 anywhere. They did struggle with it some. And I'm not here to give you numbers about what it does for affordability, because I don't have them. It's just a gradient where more units share the same cost of land and some of the same coast of infrastructure.
I guess like that, I totally get that point. I'm just thinking of like a 3-story with, a 14, 12 pitch that aesthetically looks different and adds some context to different buildings around it. Obviously the shared cost is not going to be as great, but I'm just trying to figure out where my head's at with this height and what things will look like.
Yeah, and we talk a lot. Earlier we were talking about village standards with the hack tonight, and I said, planners live in the worst case scenario world. So we're always thinking like, what's the worst, most unesthetically pleasing building that everybody's going to hate that someone could feasibly do under this? And so we talk about those maximums. So like the 80-foot building depth. Realistically, most residential buildings are built with a hall running down the long way, right? And the apartments face out either to the street or the back. And most of those max out at about 65 or 70 feet of depth, because you've just got space that's just too dark, and the apartment units are too big and long and narrow once you go much beyond that. So is every building going to be 80 feet deep and therefore be able to carry that maximum pitch roof? No. In fact, it's generally more likely that they won't. Yeah. But there's a maximum out there, so somebody doesn't go, 100. So we talked a lot about the interplay between all of these things, and the best answer I can give you is this was a assertive step beyond what the town's been doing so far. that was palatable to the commission, but also that the commission felt might encourage some development to help achieve town goals.
Thank you.
Any further questions or comments regarding number 4?
Just real quick, so what would be, from a development perspective, what would be the benefit of having like the maximum allowable 14, 12 pitch roof on a 5-story building versus having the 512 pitch roof? It's just increased space in the attic for what, I mean.
Honestly, you know, once you get above that occupiable story, it's not something anybody's paying rent on. It might be that somebody's just got an architect who says, I want to create an iconic building in Williston, or that just, you know, I'm building a replica of the Chateau Frontenac, and, you know, I want that green tower.
Yeah.
I've seen building, you know, there are some tall buildings on the UVM campus with these very steep pitched roofs that was pretty much, I think, an architectural choice and a style choice and a sort of a statement thing. But in general, it makes probably not a lot of sense. It's more materials, it's more space to deal with, it's more height to deal with in the construction process, and it's not paying rent at the end of the day. You know, there may also be a building where it does make sense for somebody. And so that's why we landed with that range. And, you know, when you talk to architects about form-based codes, what they're almost universally going to say is, give us flexibility so we can do cool, creative stuff. And so you try to do that, but also preclude the things that you think, you know, you don't want.
Moving on to topic number 5, green spaces, which you've talked a little bit about.
Yeah, let me say one more thing about building height.
Yeah, sure.
There has also been some background conversation about added flexibility of reducing some of the minimums. So, you know, even including allowing in some areas 1 story. And if folks have follow-up questions about that, a lot of that did come from Taft Corners Associates. It was accomplished by the boundary move we discussed earlier, because just more land ends up in a zone where 1 story is allowed. Another way to go at that is to allow shorter buildings, and just say, you know, hey, you could do all this, but if you want to do 1 or 2 stories, that's fine. Again, it's a shifting of these numbers and just something for the board to think about. Okay, so let's talk about green spaces. And I understand, I think, the desire to revisit this on the part of the board to be a lot about the official map and the process of potentially acquiring green spaces and the potential responsibility, cost, and liability the town might take on in constructing and maintaining them and acquiring the land. So if that is the case, the options we looked at were really talking about how much, or if at all, desired green spaces show up on the regulating plan and show up on the official map. And what we gave you in the illustrations, I think, were just some of the reasons that the commission felt the way they did and conveyed to you a draft that does include these planned and it essentially required public green spaces within the area. And I think the interesting one I talked about a little earlier is 5B in the upper right corner that shows these green circles, and that's a 2.5-minute walk radius around each of the greens that the plan anticipates would be public and would be developed as some kind of structured park by the town and accommodated by the development community as they build those places out. So really general sentiment from the Planning Commission, people who live in Taft Corners in the future ought to be able to walk to some place public and green. COVID showed us that there's a need for places for people to gather safely, and that those may be outdoors. And also, you know, in an environment like this, where we're not talking about a, you know, more conventional subdivision that just provides a playground somewhere, there's a need for people who are living in this sort of a pattern to have access to green spaces that they can walk to. And public makes more sense than necessarily just relying on the small green spaces that would be required as part of every development. And I think throughout the vision process and the planning commission process, we heard consistent public comment, there should be more green in Taft Corners planned for. So here we are with a map and what we think is the strongest and best way for the town to actually achieve that green space, but with some questions from the board about, well, what does this all mean for us, and what are we, what are we committing the town to? What are we signing ourselves up for? And if we really want this, how do we really do it? So I'll maybe start from there, and hopefully I've captured what the question was.
I think so, but questions or comments?
Well, the only question or comment I have is, back in topic 2, we had the bonus option, which is this, there'd be a policy for there to be there'd be a select board adopt a policy that relatively quickly would address questions about changing the regulating plan based on a project that's going through the approval process. Doesn't that kind of address the green space question? I mean, if we have such a process in place, we might keep the regulating plan the way it is right now, but when it gets to a specific process and we're starting to weigh the benefits of the project versus the green space versus all the other things that go into it, I mean, is that the place to actually have that conversation versus trying to do it overall right now for the whole overlay district?
Right. So I've used this metaphor a lot. The regulating plan and official map, as it shows streets and green spaces, is a wish list. You're saying, as a matter of policy, if this were adopted, these are the things we'd like to acquire and put into that statutorily enabled process where we, the town, get to at least think about trying to require them when they're imminently otherwise up for development. Yeah. And I revisit the answer I gave earlier, which is to say, if it's somebody developing one particular site with a green or portion of green on it, that's kind of one thing, and I think that follows that 120 days to make a decision about pursuing acquisition pattern. If somebody's master planning an area, and whether we showed the Trader Lane green here, which is a new idea that came out of the vision. It's not part of the long-standing idea for Trader Lane. And if through the process of working with landowners to develop Trader Lane, there's a different idea, part of operationalizing that idea would be to amend these documents. Yeah. In other words, that's that second option of, select board, I'm kind of looking globally at this whole area, this street we're going to try to build and everything else. And really, the map that's in the official map and regulating plan isn't quite where we want to go. Let's just change it, and then let's follow that second process, the 120-day process, going forward in the future. So official map and regulating plan's a wish list. It does put these desired greens in a position where the town can assert itself and say, yeah, we really want to enter into an attempt to acquire that, or no, we don't. And then it's as if it doesn't exist. And development can proceed as if the land is developable as it is under the rest of the building form standard. So that's a lot of my answer. Putting on or taking off of the map is putting on or taking off of the wish list. Right. And I think where the Planning Commission landed was, let's have a wish list that's like encompassing of everything we think we need, or at least a consensus on everything we need. I think there were voices on the commission who still said there should be more.
Yeah.
So basically, the green spaces are kind of a right of first refusal for the town.
Yes.
And what's, I'm sorry, I should know this, what is it, 120 days? How long does the town have to accept that?
So the town has 120 days to decide if it's going to enter into good faith effort to acquire.
Okay.
The appraisal and acquisition timeline could take longer than that. I think what statute imagines is everybody's working together pretty closely at that point. And, you know, when we talk to our neighboring communities about how do they handle this under official map, there are some communities like Heinsberg told us, you know, we don't put parks and green spaces on unless they're ones we've already gotten into our capital plan. That's one way to do it is don't put it on the wish list until you know you can afford it. But the other thing we heard from a lot of communities is often it just makes sense for the developer to provide that green space as part of the project they're planning. And, you know, we've offered this up in concert with a bylaw amendment that would make the value of that green an offset to the recreation impact fee that is otherwise built to all residential projects. So the hope here is that that right of first refusal process is not the one that's followed most of the time, but rather there's a collaborative process, and the town has set the incentives in such a way that this stuff just happens in the course of the development being designed.
I guess with that as a possible future, and it sounds plausible, coupled with the fact that there's, you know, what I'm calling right of first refusal concept here, I guess I'm kind of wondering what the critical need to change the green space aspect of this is anyway.
I think for some folks, both in the public and on the board, it's a little bit of a reality check. Are we really going to be in a position to do this stuff financially? I should say that what statute says is developers shall accommodate. So it can mean set the land aside for the town to develop at a later date. You don't have to turn it into a park that very minute or take a turnover that very minute. It could be privately developed with an irrevocable offer, et cetera. But I think that's really, it's part of another more general and kind of consistent public comment I think we've gotten throughout this process, which is this looks like an awful lot of public infrastructure that the town is anticipating will be in this area. And the answer is, yeah, there is an awful lot of public infrastructure. The intent here is that it's built very incrementally and that you're not getting a new green or a new street to take care of unless somebody's building a pretty substantial chunk of grant list value next door to it. And that those things are going to be complementary.
Right.
Other comments or questions regarding green spaces at this point? Moving on to topic number 6, administrative approval process, which is...
Before we begin, should we talk about the copyright violation of the how a bill becomes a law?
I thought that was 75 years old.
Then I'm 85.
No. We used to have a print of that tacked up to the wall in here. So the graphic we showed is actually just illustrative of today's process and really just intended to work with a lot of public comment we get at the DRB, which is, you know, generally some criticism that's often provided to the DRB that's really a criticism of what the bylaws allow and explaining those roles. So select board adopts laws that are recommended to them by the Planning Commission, and the DRB administers them. And in the form-based code, the administrative approval process we envision does change the DRB's role. And you know, I've been talking with you folks about this since it was in the draft back in December. There are still some elements of development, especially the platting and laying out of streets and parcel boundaries, that just have to go to the DRB. but building and site design wouldn't, as this code is currently drafted. And I'd like to, though, there's been a number of comments made to the effect of the form-based code takes the select board out of the process. So to the select board members here, I'd ask you, what role do you feel you have in the development review process today? And you don't. You adopt bylaws and the DRB administers them.
Well, this specific plan would be the only,
When you're changing the zoning.
okay, right.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's a great segue because, so what does happen under this draft? The DRB is removed from some of the development review process. They are removed from reviewing the construction of a new building on a new site in this district. The draft is written to place the burden of that review on my shoulders as zoning administrator. That's how it's drafted. If the board wants to change it, you can. It's one of those things that form-based codes often offer up to the development community as an exchange for the heightened architectural and design standards. Say, well, we're going to make you work a little harder on your design, but we're going to shorten your review and make it administrative. So that's the way it's drafted. Couple other ways the DRB remains involved is, of course, any decision made by the zoning administrator is appealable to the DRB. We've also written into this draft a requirement for a butter notification by mail that's very similar to the butter notification required for a DRB hearing. So letting neighbors know that something is up for review and when it's going to be discussed. And the meeting at which that permit is discussed in terms of approval is a publicly accessible meeting. And I might have mentioned, we actually went and attended one of these in Winooski to see how that process works. The other thing is, I said a butter notification process is similar. It's actually greater than the current statutorily required butter notification with the DRB, in that we require not just the owners of properties adjacent, but anybody living in the properties adjacent to be notified. Because are you really going to know in a 50-unit apartment building that your landlord got a letter that there's a big building going up next door? And maybe you want to go participate because you're a citizen of that site, citizen of the town. You just might happen to be living in an apartment with a landlord, not in a home that you own. I should tangent for 1 second to explain that in the background of all of this conversation, we've had a complete legal review of this draft. One of the things our attorney did was he crossed that out. He said, don't do this, statute doesn't say you have to. And we looked at it and said, well, that's true, they don't say we have to. We were asked by the Planning Commission to really make sure the process was transparent. So even though it's administrative, it's still participatory, it's still open to the public to understand what decision the ZA is making and why, and to understand the rights of appeal should an approval be made. That said, there's not a lot of judgment calls in here. And that's intentional in a form-based code. So hopefully what the ZA is doing is formulaic, and in fact by statute the ZA is not to be making interpretations. They are, actually what it says is, shall interpret the bylaws literally, which means don't interpret them. But that's what statute gives us. So I wanted to highlight that because it does change the role of the DRB. There are approvals that don't happen at a public hearing. And I'll go back just 1 second to the select board's role, which today is limited to when the zoning is changed or when a specific plan is proposed. I would anticipate that functionally the select board is a lot more involved in the shaping of development in Taft Corners under this code, because of the times that somebody is going to want to change that regulating plan to move a street, to shift a green space, to give the select board the chance to acquire or not acquire one of those things. I think, sorry, if you adopt this, this code places a significant workload back to the select board to engage with the development community in the master planning and layout of Taft Corners.
So we'll be meeting 3 times a month?
We'll have one meeting a month that's just for development. No, I do think that will happen more than it is happening now under the specific plan process, yes. So, you know, the options we gave you to think about here would be to change the permit procedure and take what the zoning administrator would issue in the draft and just make it something the DRB does. We could take that project review committee meeting format, we could take this review, we could take the application checklist and findings memo that we were already anticipating the zoning administrator would write, we could write it, and we could hear it at the DRB, you know, in whatever time it made sense. The difference, of course, then is if somebody doesn't like what the DRB said, the appeal goes to state environmental court. If somebody doesn't like what I do, it goes to the DRB.
Okay, that was one of my questions. How does, I mean, the DRB obviously at least agreed with the concept of having a discretionary permit issued by the zoning administrator. Was there any dissent on that? Were there those who strongly felt it should stay with the DRB? And I'm thinking back to the days when we used to have a planning commission that did both roles, the current planning commission's role and the current DRB's role. And there were members who were pretty upset at the split. And so it could be that there were DRB members who were not happy with this proposal. On the other hand, there could be members who were dancing out of that meeting where that decision was made.
So we held a couple of training nights with the DRB to talk about this draft and to talk about how it could potentially change their role and what the code could potentially allow and not allow. And I was really surprised there was actually very little pushback on that idea. And I think I know why. And if you were to go look at any number of recent site plan or subdivision reviews that our program has staffed in front of the DRB, what you're going to find is a very lengthy staff report with a recitation of all of the various ways in which the project meets the development bylaw, like 99%. And then there's going to be a note that says, but the DRB should decide if a condition is necessary to determine the sequencing of the installation of the public art. And that is to say, when we're reviewing especially a site plan and a individual building and site, we're really often drilling down to very small details. And where we've struggled and debated, a recent example would be the LL Bean building. There was tension around the sort of general way in which the current bylaw says we'd really like buildings in this district to have pitched roofs. And of course, LL Bean and the builder of that building not wanting a pitched roof. And in fact, there was even sort of a design that kind of tacked on some pitched roof elements, didn't really make a lot of sense, and ultimately before the DRB it was refined, and the DRB just sort of, their role in that was to kind of weigh the town's stated, kind of in a should sort of way, have pitched roof bylaw standard against the applicant saying pitched roof really doesn't work on this building. And so those are the kinds of things the DRB ends up weighing, and those are the kinds of things we're trying to clarify in here. So I think in working with the DRB to talk about that, to talk about the way this would make the development standards more prescriptive, there's a lot of options, but there's some very specific language about what those options are. I think I heard from at least one or two members, well, what would we do if we were reviewing this? It's either going to meet this or it isn't. And that is very much the intent.
Okay.
And, you know, that said, again, much like building height, if the board wants these projects reviewed by the DRB instead of the administrator, it's a few lines in the code to change that and place that responsibility on the DRB. And we, the staff, will write the staff reports and set up the hearings and present what we think the draft findings are to the DRB, but they would be the ones taking the vote.
You mentioned the piece about wanting to keep the process transparent and the ability to, for residents to participate. Under the proposal where it would be an administrative permit issued by the zoning administrator, what would be the opportunities for the public to participate?
Going to make me open the code. So if we go into the administration chapter, which is chapter 8 in your binder, and I'll just correct you, we've given this kind of permit a new name. It's a certificate of conformity.
Okay.
But it functions like a discretionary permit review in front of the DRB. So we have a bunch of sections here, and we talk a little bit about procedure in, let me see where I go. I think we're mostly in section E, but there may be, I'm looking for the section with the additional abutter notice and not finding it, so it may take me a minute.
On D at the very bottom, operational
Thank
procedures,
you.
number 2.
I skipped right over it. So this bylaw change creates what's called a project review committee. It is a staff committee. It's the same people who look at projects today. It's the zoning administrator, the fire chief, police chief, public works director. But the difference is they have a meeting. It's not a hearing, it's a meeting, and that means we get a little bit of flexibility about when we can hold them and how we can schedule them. But we do require a 7-day notice of that meeting. We do require a written staff report. And I'll also say that because the Planning Commission asked for a lot of transparency, what we've had done is we've had all of the requirements in the form-based code drafted into the form of a checklist, where the applicant goes through their proposal, and for each requirement that's applicable, they mark, yes, I meet it, and here's the page of my submittal where you can go read about how I meet it. And then there's a third place for the zoning administrator to say, yes, I looked at that and I agree. So we want to make all of that available for folks to see, so they know what's going on as projects come in under review here.
I mean, the process, I think I get the process, just a quick, is 7 days enough? I'm just thinking, you're on vacation, you get the notice, and you don't even know the hearing happened because you didn't return until day 8. So that's a minor little thing. I'd like to go back to the appeal process. So let's, the zoning administrator issues their certificate of conformity. The landowner is not happy with it and appeals to the DRB. The DRB, let's say, supports the decision that the certificate and says, yes, we agree, it should have been issued and this is how it should have been issued. That could appeal and it goes to the environmental court. What would happen there? What are the, you know, how would that work, I guess?
So generally, there would be an initial statement of questions prepared by the appellant. That would be we get notice that it's happening, that the decision's been appealed, et cetera. But the first thing we really interact with is a statement of questions where the appellant lays out why they think that the ZA and the DRB got it wrong. Is it true that this project meets XYZ requirement? Is it, I mean, it's a little different because these approvals aren't really very conditional. It's either you perfect your application or you don't get a permit. Whereas, DRB approvals often say, what you told us you want to do is okay as long as you do this, that, and the other at your final plan. And sometimes there are appeals about those conditions. So here, I'm trying to imagine someone who got an approval they didn't like. It would be more likely they would get a denial they didn't like, and they would appeal that. Can we go with that example?
Sure.
So they propose a site layout that I as zoning administrator believe doesn't meet some element of the requirements in here, and they say, well, I don't think that means what you think it means, and the DRB agrees with me, but they disagree. That's put in front of an E-court judge. And we would make they would make their statement of questions, we would make our response, there would probably be motions for summary judgment where say, we really think we're right and this should all just be thrown out, and they might say, we really think we're right and should just prevail, et cetera. And we might even go to trial. We might even do a site visit with the judge, we've done that in the past. But really, we would be presenting, the E-court judge basically becomes the DRB.
Yeah.
And they're saying, okay, now I'm reviewing this like I'm the Williston DRB. Give me the facts. What does the code say? What does the proposal say? And, asking for help from the appellant and the appellee on that in the form of briefs and statements. But they become the DRB essentially, and re-review that. And, they might decide the DRB was right. They might remand something back to the DRB and say, we don't think you got this quite right. We think you need to look at it again. I'm not quite sure. There have not been a lot of appeals in Vermont of form-based code approvals or denials that I'm aware of. And compared to the appeals of DRB decisions that I have experienced, most have been about something in the bylaw or the conditions that felt vague to somebody. Somebody said, I don't think that means what you think it means. And that becomes the appeal.
A concern I have is in order for us to see Taft's Corners develop in the way we would like to develop, you need two things. You need a landowner who's willing to develop, and you need the town with the appropriate code in place that lets them develop. If landowners just find that they can't live with the form-based code and we have nothing happening, is that a potential liability that we're going to get into this sort of doldrum state where nothing is happening because landowners aren't interested in moving ahead with projects because they don't feel that those projects that they're allowed to do will work for them? Does that question make sense? And is that a concern?
Sure. The main concern is if that were to happen, the vision that the public worked on at the beginning of this process just would not be achieved. Goals of the town plan would not be achieved.
Right.
And there's always the possibility that you've become so strict and so prescriptive or required a type of development that is so expensive to build that nobody will build to it. That sort of thing tends to work itself out pretty quickly.
It becomes evident very quickly.
Yeah.
Maybe, okay.
I struggle to think of examples of places, big places, or fast-growing places with a lot of development pressure that have truly been able to regulate themselves into stagnation.
Good word for it.
It's or a sort of a sterile environment.
Yeah.
I think where you do see it is small resort communities with historic main streets that have just so much regulatory weight on top of everything because there's so much concern that somebody's going to do something wrong, or you start to get an atmosphere of participants saying, well, I had to go through XYZ onerous process, so should the person next to me, and you can get a little more of a gridlock that way. Unfortunately, the real outcome of being overly restrictive is only those who can sue their way to victory end up getting to build anything. And that's not really a good way to do planning or growth or development either.
Yeah.
I think I've had enough conversations with folks who are thinking about what it would be like to redevelop properties in Taft Corners under this code to believe that there are feasible projects that are doable under the code. You know, we hired a consultant who's developed a number of these codes. And I shudder to make this comparison because I think a lot of people have a hard time with it, but our consultant wrote the form-based code for the corridors in Winooski, where there is certainly a great deal of development and redevelopment taking place.
What was that part of Winooski again?
So it's East Allen Street, Main Street, Mallets Bay Avenue.
Okay.
The main corridors in are under a form-based code. If you were to go look at it, some of the maps and illustrations would look quite familiar to you. And we watch it with great interest because we have the same author working for us and can test some things out that way. But, you know, certainly as evidenced, whether you like what's happening there or not, and our architectural standards are different, our site design standards are somewhat different, people have found ways to develop in some pretty challenging sites and environments and meet that code over the last 5 years.
Okay, that's good to know, and if I could, part of what you're saying is form-based code such as what's being proposed here has survived legal scrutiny. We are not so much taking away a landowner's right to develop that there's laws against that type of thing.
So I ended up this winter on the chairlift with a prominent Vermont land use attorney. And unfortunately, somebody had told him who I was and what I did for a living.
Yeah.
And he said, all right, he said, what is this form-based code stuff? You've got until we get to the top of the mountain.
And this was a land use attorney?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hadn't worked in form-based code, but lives in a community in Vermont where it's become a hot topic, not Williston. And I said, okay, well, you know how zoning says like how tall buildings can be and where they go on the site and maybe says some things about, you know, the architecture and all that. He said, yeah. I said, it's form-based code. It's a kind of zoning. It's not all that fundamentally different from zoning. It is a different way to express those ideas. And in the case of a place like Williston, what's really fundamentally different is there's so much master planning to do because we're not redeveloping a walkable urban grid with a compatible building form. We're evolving. And we have significant land and undeveloped places that give us enough big question marks that it's time to do some really careful planning around it. I said, but at its heart, form-based code is about what buildings are going to look like, how big they're going to be, where they're going to go. It's even a little bit about what you're allowed to do inside of them, despite everybody saying it's only about form. There's a use chapter in here. It's different, but it's there. That's what it is. In Vermont, where statute gives us the official map tool, there's a real opportunity to partner form-based code with master planning and set up a whole regime where there's collaboration between the public and private sector around the way new development is going to lay out. And that's what I really am excited about and think Williston is getting to here that's different from what I perceive as a little bit of a disconnect between many of the Williston Taft Corners master planning efforts that occurred in the past and the implementation via zoning, which often happened years apart in time and fairly distant in concept. That said, you go back to 1987 and there's the ring road diagram that says we ought to have a way to get around the Taft Corners intersection. Well, that has carried forward and you know, I think to great benefit of the town. Again, this is a refinement of those same ideas.
Any final questions on this tonight? It's been very helpful, I think, for us to hear this tonight, and I think going forward, we'll be looking to start the process of making recommendations or adopting particular parts of the code as we get to the next meeting, which will be August 23rd. We will not be doing anything as far as the special meeting except for the CUD.
Can I just make one comment?
Yeah.
I'll be as brief as I can. So I missed last meeting, and I did watch the video. Actually, it was incredibly helpful, partly because I have trouble in public hearings trying to take notes and listen at the same time, and this was great because I could hit the pause button. But I wanted to pick up on a comment that a resident made where they said, you know, finally the community is asked and gotten involved, feels so much better than what's happened before. And that's just, I think, a real comment about this process that you and the Planning Commission have embarked on. We have not had this level of public participation in any of our ordinances as long as I've been on the select board, and I've been on the select board for like 25 years. I mean, that is, I mean, you know, kudos for that. You know, it feels good. This is the way a community like Williston ought to consider something so important, such as, you know, what we're talking about.
Well, you know, thank you, and I extend that compliment
thank you
to the staff, the Planning
Please do.
Commission.
Yeah.
We've had a great team, both working to create the capacity to be able to do this for the last many years. We've been working towards just having the training, the time and capacity to do this sort of thing. We've asked our Planning Commission to do an incredible amount of work over the last 2 years, and they've really stepped up to it. We've asked the community to engage with us in the depths of COVID. We've asked them to go to yet another Zoom meeting, and they have. We've asked people to ask us hard questions about this, and they have. We've thanked people who are having trouble with this for their continued engagement, for sticking it out through, again, what can be a very difficult process, imagining change and growth and development, and, you know, in many ways, confronting some hard facts that things don't stay the same and you can't go home again. It's just tough. And having to envision those things, but also understanding that there are these opportunities out there to shape that future. And I do believe, just in sort of its arc, Williston and Taft Corners in particular is at a really critical moment where something can be done, and it probably won't last forever, and it might not come back again for a while. So we really appreciate the community's engagement with this. The select board's dedicated more time to this than anything I think we've ever brought to you as a planning staff, and we very much appreciate that. I would just close by encouraging each board member to look at those options we created, think about if there's others that you'd write in there as options you're interested in. We did a lot of straw polling with the Planning Commission when we did similar work sessions. Kind of do that for yourself, fill it in, where do I land on these? And you know, the edits, again, are all pretty mechanically easy for the staff to make at this point. We just need the direction. If we get that out of a work session, we can say, okay, you know, this is how much time we need for a hearing, and we can continue to move on. So
I do have a couple of things I would like to talk to you that aren't captured in the 6 topics for tonight. I would look to you and Eric to see if that's okay to do that.
okay,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.
Planning Commission. So we're back to Eric for the manager's report.
All right, I'm back. Just a couple brief items I'll touch on for my written report this evening. Fiscal year 2023 tax bills have been mailed. Folks will be receiving those if they haven't already, and a reminder, the first installment will be due August the 15th. To recognize our 2 new Police Academy graduates, Officer Sabrina Booton and Officer Kelsey Parker, graduated from the 113th Vermont Police Academy last Friday, July 15th. Big congratulations on their hard work in the Police Academy. And then this has been shared the last couple of weeks, but just for the public listening, we've transitioned our dispatch to Essex Police, primarily Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday, our lowest volume nights of the week. This was done with a change in level of service from the state police. Things have gone well the first couple of weeks I've heard. This is our lowest call volume of the week. This is a temporary agreement through September with Essex to allow our departments to look at some additional options, and certainly bring this to the board in August and September to discuss the options here. And as we look at this, Chittenden County Public Safety Authority to provide regional dispatch is still moving forward, working through the final steps to get all the capital costs lined up for that project. And hopefully we'll have that operational in the next coming period of time here to look at that as a as a next option as we work through this transition phase here. Then I'll also share, we have the COVID-19 antigen tests in Town Hall available. We received 4 large boxes from the state. We have them available at Town Hall and the library. A lot of folks have come in and to take advantage of that. You can have 4 boxes that have 2 kits in it each. So we'll continue to make those available at Town Hall, and let's see if we can get some more if we run out here. And that's all I have for my written report this evening. Thank you.
You're enjoying your vacation, except for tonight, and
Thank you.
so other business, we do have a catering permit that came in today, and Aaron has provided us with a copy of that, but if you could give us a quick overview of it, that would be helpful.
Sure, so today 802 Cocktails LLC submitted a request to cater. They're asking to serve beer, wine, and spirits for a wedding to take place at 3515 Oak Hill Road on August 6th from 4 to 11 p.m. There will be approximately 110 people in attendance. So this approval would require a motion from the select board.
Good, thanks. Any questions for Aaron?
The address,
This is
3550.
the Isham Farm.
I'm sorry, it's, okay, sorry. Yeah. Did you say that?
I didn't know that, but now I do.
Yes, okay.
Any questions for Aaron on this? I'm looking for a motion.
Move we approve.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion on the motion? Hearing none, all those in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Any other business to bring forward tonight?
Terry, one other really brief item. We forgot with our reappointment list back in June for the CCRPC Clean Water Advisory Committee. Stormwater Coordinator Christine Doherty and Public Works Director Bruce Hoare have served on that. Christine as the primary and Bruce as the alternate. Should the board wish to consider a reappointment, we just ask that they're reappointed for a 2-year term through June 30th of 2024.
Is there a motion to do that?
So moved.
Second.
Motion is made and seconded. Is there any discussion on the motion? If not, all those in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? All right, last chance for other business. If not, we are adjourned. Thank you.